Let's talk about the location of the heart. Let's talk about the anatomy here. So the heart is in the center of the thoracic cavity. It's usually about the size of your fist, right? Weighs about 250 to 350 grams. Now, if you're a bigger person with a bigger fist, your heart is likely bigger. A smaller person, a woman or a child, your heart is also likely smaller. It sits on top of the diaphragm, which is that muscle that's important for breathing. And that muscle pretty much separates the abdominal cavity, which is below, from the thoracic cavity, which is above. Now, as you can see, bordered on either side of the heart very neatly are both lungs. So both lungs pretty much cram right around the heart. And both of these organs, the lungs and the heart, are covered by this serous membrane that we talked about. And the serous membrane has that fluid that helps to lubricate the heart as there is movement in the heart, right? And that helps to decrease the friction as the heart beats and as the lungs move. And that's called the pericardium. All right, let's look at the wall of the heart. So there are three layers to the heart wall. The epicardium is the outer external membrane. The myocardium is the thicker, meatier, muscular part of the heart. This is the actual heart muscle, the cardiovascular muscle. And then the endothelium is pretty much an epithelial layer, right? It's a thin layer of cells that lines the inside of the heart. And this is an epithelial layer. But in the case of the heart, we call it an endothelium layer. So these are the three layers of the heart wall. All right, let's talk about valves. Now, valves, so valves, pretty much as I mentioned earlier, help to prevent black flow of blood with the cardiac cycle. So as the atria beat or contract, they squeeze blood from the atria down into the ventricle. And when the ventricles are ready to contract, the valve between the atria and the ventricle has to close to prevent black flow of that blood back into the atria. All right? And so the cardiovascular system moves blood from one chamber to the other in that way. It also uses the pressure difference between chambers. This is a very important concept for you to understand. We're going to talk about this later on when we look at the cardiac cycle. So basically, pressure is what drives blood from one chamber to the other. All right? When I say pressure, I mean the contraction of that chamber, the squeezing of that chamber. And blood is only going to flow from an area of high concentration or high pressure to an area of low pressure. So basically, the atria has to generate enough pressure to overcome or to be higher than the pressure in the ventricle in order for blood to move from the atria to the ventricle. Okay, I'll say that again. The atria has to squeeze and contract to generate enough pressure so that it's now higher than whatever pressure is in the ventricle, and that way blood will move from the atria down into the ventricle. Similarly, the ventricle has to contract and generate enough pressure such that it's greater than the pressure in the vessel in order for blood to move from that high pressure area, which is the ventricle, into that low pressure area, which is the vessel. So pressure is what makes blood move through the heart and into those vessels. Okay? Normal direction is going to be from atria to ventricles, ventricles to arteries. Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about when we look at the location of these valves. There's valves between atria and ventricles. There are valves between the ventricles and the exiting arteries. Also, I want to mention here is that the opening of valves is a passive process. So there's no contracting of a valve. Valves don't have muscles. They're basically being pulled or pushed based on the pressure of blood. When the atria squeezes and generates enough pressure, blood wants to go into the ventricle, and so that valve just gives way. This is a passive process. The valve is not made of a muscle. It doesn't squeeze, it doesn't contract. What's contracting is the actual chamber, and then the pressurized blood moves as the valve gives way. Okay. All right, so let's talk about the two types of valves we have. We have AV valves, which are called atrioventricular valves, and these separate atria from ventricle. Okay, there are two of them. There's one on the right side of the heart separating the right atria from the right ventricle, and there's one on the left side of the heart separating the left atrium from the left ventricle. Now, the AV valve on the right side of the heart is often called the tricuspid valve because it has three cusps. cusps are basically these leaflets right, so this is a valve. And these two dangling parts of the valve that go down into the exiting chamber are what we call the cusps. If there are two cusps, we say it's a bicuspid valve. In the case of the left side, if there are three cusps, we say it's a tricuspid valve in the case of the right side of the heart. The bicuspid valve is sometimes called the mitral valve. That's a common name, and it's because of its shape, like the mitre of a bishop. Also, we have papillary muscles and the chorda tendineae attached to the valves on both sides of the heart. So the AV valves are attached to the papillary muscles and the chorda tendineae. And these basically prevent the valves from prolapsing. Right? Prolapsing means that the valves are going to go into the wrong direction. They're going to go back up into the chamber that they're coming from. And that doesn't happen because of the papillary muscle. So the papillary muscle is a part of the wall of the ventricle. So this is your chamber. Right, this is going to be your right ventricle. This is the septum that separates the right ventricle from the left ventricle. This is the valve. In this case, this will be the tricuspid valve. We have the chorda tendineae, also called tendinous cords, and they're reaching down and attached to the papillary muscle. So this projection here is actually the muscular part of this wall, and it's called the papillary muscle. So when the AV valve is open, this ventricle is nice and relaxed, and it will fill. Right? It will fill when it's relaxed. Blood will be moving from the atrium into the ventricle. And so what we have is that the papillary muscles are not contracting, and so they're relaxed, and the tendons are not being pulled very tightly. Alternatively, when the ventricle contracts, right, the AV valve should be closed at this point because blood is now moving from this ventricle out into this vessel. It's not going back into the previous chamber. It's supposed to be exiting the heart at this point. And so what happens is the papillary muscles contract very tightly, which drags these tendons, right? It puts some strain on these tendons, and they pull very tightly and keep that valve in place. And that prevents the valve from going back into the area, into the chamber where it should not be going, okay? So again, the contraction of the papillary muscles, the pulling, the tightening of those tendinous cords help to keep the valve closed during a time when the ventricle is contracting and blood should not be moving back into the chamber. Okay. And we see this on both sides, left ventricle as well as the right ventricle. All right, let's talk about the semilunar valves now. So the semilunar valves, again, two types: aortic valve, which separates the right ventricle from the left ventricle from the aorta. Right, remember the left ventricle leads out into the aorta, which leads to the systemic circulation, whereas the pulmonary valve is going from the heart into the lungs. Okay, and so we separate the right ventricle from the pulmonary vein. So let's point that out here. All right, the aortic valve would be leaving the left ventricle, and this would be your aortic valve going between your left ventricle and your aorta. Whereas your pulmonary valve separates your right ventricle from your pulmonary veins, and these are going to your lungs on both sides. Okay. So again, we do not want backflow of blood from the vessel back into the chamber. And so these valves are called semilunar because of their shape. They have this sort of semilunar shape, and they bulge down into the chamber and prevent backflow of blood as it leaves the heart and goes out into that vessel. Now, when these valves closed, when the ventricle is relaxed, they are basically slamming, there's blood that's slamming against the back of that shut valve. And that's what brings about the heart sounds. We'll talk about the heart sounds later on. But just know that blood actually hits the back of those valves as they close when the chamber is relaxed. Okay?